Introduction of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. Charles Baudelaire by James Huneker. 1. For the sentimental, no greater foe exists than the iconoclast who dissipates literary legends, and he is abroad nowadays. Those golden times when they gossiped of De Quincey's enormous opium consumption, of the gin absorbed by gentle Charles Lamb, of Coleridge's dark ways, Byron's escapades, and Shelley's atheism, alas, into what fated limbo have they vanished? Poe, too, whom we saw in fancy reeling from Richmond to Baltimore, Baltimore to Philadelphia, Philadelphia to New York. Those familiar, fascinating anecdotes have gone the way of all such jerry-built spooks. We now know Poe to have been a man suffering at the time of his death from cerebral lesion, a man who drank at intervals and little. Dr. Guerriere of Paris has exploded a darling superstition about De Quincey's opium eating. He has demonstrated that no man could have lived so long. De Quincey was nearly 75 at his death, and worked so hard if he had consumed 12,000 drops of laudanum as often as he said he did. Furthermore, the English essayist's description of the drug's effects is inexact. He was seldom sleepy, a sure sign, asserts Dr. Guerriere, that he was not altogether enslaved by the drug habit. Sprightly in old age, his powers of labor were prolonged until past 70. His imagination needed little opium to produce the famous Confessions. Even Gautier's revolutionary red waistcoat wore at the premiere of Hernani was, according to Gautier, a pink doublet. And Rousseau has been whitewashed, so they are disappearing, those literary legends, until disheartened we cry out, "Spare us, dear old-fashioned, disreputable men of genius." But the legend of Charles Baudelaire is seemingly indestructible. This French poet has suffered more from the friendly, malignant biographer and chroniclers than did Poe. "Who shall keep the curs out of the cemetery?" asked Baudelaire after he had read Griswold on Poe. A few years later his own cemetery was invaded, and the world was put into possession of the Baudelaire legend, that legend of the atrabilious, irritable poet, dandy, maniac, his hair dyed green, spouting blasphemies, that grim, despairing image of a diabolic, a libertine, saint, and drunkard. Maxime de Camp was much to blame for the promulgation of these tales, witness his Souvenirs littéraires. However, it may be confessed that part of the Baudelaire legend was created by Charles Baudelaire. In the history of literature, it is difficult to parallel such a deliberate piece of self-stultification. Not Villon, who preceded him, nor Verlaine, who imitated him, drew for the astonishment or disedification of the world a like unflattering portrait. Mystifier as he was, he must have suffered at times from acute cortical irritation, and notwithstanding his desperate effort to realize Poe's idea, he only proved Poe correct, who had said that no man can bear his heart quite naked. There always will be something held back, something false, ostentatiously thrust forward. The grimace, the attitude, the pomp of rhetoric are so many buffers between the soul of man and the sharp reality of published confessions. Baudelaire was no more exception to this rule than St. Augustine, Bunyan, Rousseau, or Heisman, though he was as frank as any of them, as we may see in the printed diary, Mon cœur mis à nu, posthumous works, Société de Mercure de France, and in the journal, Fusée, Lettres, and other fragments exhumed by devoted Baudelaireans. To smash legends, Eugène Coipet's biography, study, first printed in 1887, has been republished with new notes by his son, Jacques Coipet. This is an exceedingly valuable contribution to Baudelaire lore. A dispassionate life, however, has yet to be written. A noble task for some young poet who will disentangle the conflicting lies originated by Baudelaire, that tragic comedian, from the truth, and thus save him from himself. The Coipet volume is really but a series of notes. There are some letters addressed to the poet by the distinguished men of his day, supplementing the rather disappointing volume of letters, 1841 to 1866, published in 1908. There are also documents in the legal prosecution of Baudelaire, with memories of him by Charles Asselineau, Léon Cladel, Camille Lemonnier, and others. In November of 1850, Maxime de Camp and Gustave Flaubert found themselves at the French ambassador's Constantinople. The two friends had taken a trip in the Orient, which later bore fruit in Salammbô. General Opic, the representative of the French government, cordially the young men received. They were presented to his wife, Madame Opic. She was the mother of Charles Baudelaire, and inquired rather anxiously of Decamps, "My son has talent, has he not?" Unhappy because her second marriage, a brilliant one, had set her son against her, the poor woman welcomed from such a source confirmation of her eccentric boy's gifts. Decamps tells the much-discussed story of a quarrel between the youthful Charles and his stepfather, a quarrel that began at table. There were guests present. After some words, Charles bounded at the general's throat and sought to strangle him. He was promptly boxed on the ears and succumbed to a nervous spasm. A delightful anecdote, one that fills with joy psychiatrists in search of a theory of genius and degeneration. Charles was given some money and put on board a ship sailing to East India. He became a cattle dealer in the British Army and returned to France years afterward with a Venus Noire, to whom he addressed extravagant poems. All this according to Decamps. Here is another tale, a comical one. Baudelaire visited Decamps in Paris, and his hair was violently green. Decamps said nothing. Angered by this indifference, Baudelaire asked, "You find nothing abnormal about me?" "No," was the answer. "But my hair, it is green." "That is not singular, mon cher Baudelaire. Everyone has hair more or less green in Paris." Disappointed in not creating a sensation, Baudelaire went to a café, gulped down 2 large bottles of Burgundy, and asked the waiter to remove the water, as water was a disagreeable sight. Then he went away in a rage. It is a pity to doubt this green hair legend. Presently a man of genius will not be able to enjoy an epileptic fit in peace, as does a banker or a beggar. We are told that St. Paul, Mahomet, Handel, Napoleon, Flaubert, Dostoevsky were epileptoids, yet we do not encounter men of this rare kind among the inmates of asylums. Even Baudelaire had his sane moments. The joke of the green hair has been disposed of by Coppet. Baudelaire's hair thinning after an illness, he had his head shaved and painted with salve of a green hue, hoping thereby to escape baldness. At the time when he had embarked for Calcutta, May 1841, he was not 17 but 20 years of age. Decamps said he was 17 when he attacked General Opic. The dinner could not have taken place at Lyons, because the Opic family had left that city 6 years before the date given by Decamps. Charles was provided with 5,000 francs for his expenses instead of 20, Decamps' version, and he never was a beef drover in the British Army, for a good reason. He never reached India. Instead, he disembarked at the Isle of Bourbon, and after a short stay suffered from homesickness and returned to France, after being absent about 10 months. But, like Flaubert, on his return home, Baudelaire was seized with the nostalgia of the East. Over there he had yearned for Paris. Jules Claretie recalls Baudelaire saying to him with a grimace, "I love Wagner, but the music I prefer is that of a cat hung up by its tail outside of a window, and trying to stick to the panes of glass with its claws. There is an odd grating on the glass which I find at the same time strange, irritating, and singularly harmonious." Is it necessary to add that Baudelaire, notorious in Paris for his love of cats, dedicating poems to cats, would never have perpetuated such revolting cruelty? Another misconception, a critical one, is the case of Poe and Baudelaire. The young Frenchman first became infatuated with Poe's writings in 1846 or 1847. He gave these 2 dates, though several stories of Poe had been translated into French as early as 1841 or 1842. Laurent Joutain was the first, which we know as The Murderers in the Rue Morgue. Madame Meunier also adapted several Poe stories for the reviews. Baudelaire's labors as a translator lasted over 10 years. That he assimilated Poe, that he idolized Poe, is a commonplace of literary gossip. But that Poe had overwhelming influence in the formation of his poetic genius is not the truth. Yet we find such an acute critic as the late Edmund Clarence Stedman writing, "Poe's chief influence upon Baudelaire's own production relates to poetry." It is precisely the reverse. Poe's influence affected Baudelaire's prose, notably in the disjointed confessions Mon cœur mis à nu, which vaguely recall the American writer's marginalia. The bulk in the poetry in Les Fleurs de Mal was written before Baudelaire had read Poe, though not published in book form until 1857. But in 1855 some of the poems saw the light in the Revue des Deux Mondes, while many of them had been put forth a decade or 15 years before as fugitive verse in various magazines. Stedman was not the first to make this mistake. In Bayard Taylor's The Echo Club we find on page 24 this criticism. There is a congenital twist about Poe. Baudelaire and Swinburne after him had been trying to suppress him by increasing the dose. but his muse is the natural Pythia inheriting her convulsions, while they eat all sorts of insane roots to produce theirs. This must have been written about 1872, and after reading it one would fancy that Poe and Baudelaire were rhapsodic wrigglers on the poetic tripod, whereas their poetry is often reserved, even glacial. Baudelaire, like Poe, sometimes built his nests with the birds of night, and that was enough to condemn the work of both men by critics of the didactic school. Once, when Baudelaire heard that an American man of letters was in Paris, he secured an introduction and called on him. Eagerly inquiring after Poe, he learned that he was not considered a genteel person in America. Baudelaire withdrew, muttering maledictions. Enthusiastic poet, charming literary person. Yet the American, whoever he was, represented public opinion at the time. Today, criticisms of Poe are vitiated by the desire to make him an angel. It is to be doubted whether, without his barren environment and hard fortunes, we should have had Poe at all. He had to dig down deep into the pit of his personality to reach the central core of his music. But every ardent young soul entering literature begins by a vindication of Poe's character. Poe was a man, and he is now a classic. He was a half-charlatan, as was Baudelaire, and both the sublime and the sickly were never far asunder. The pair loved to mystify, to play pranks on their contemporaries. Both were implacable pessimists. Both were educated in affluence, and both had to face unprepared the hardships of life. The hastiest comparison of their poetic work will show that their only common ideal was the worship of an exotic beauty. Their artistic methods of expression were totally dissimilar. Baudelaire, like Poe, had a harp-like temperament, which vibrated in the presence of strange subjects. Above all, he was obsessed by sex. Women as angel of destruction is the keynote of his poems. Poe was almost sexless. His aerial creatures never footed the dusty highways of the world. His lovely lines, "Helen, thy beauty is to me," could never have been written by Baudelaire, while Poe would never have pardoned the fulgurant grandeur, the Beethoven-like harmonies, the Dante-esque horrors of that deep-wide music of lost souls in Femme damnée. Descend, lamentable victime, or this which might serve as a text for one of John Martin's vast sinister mezzotints. J'ai vu parfois au fond d'un théâtre banal, qu'enflammait l'orchestre sonore, un fer allumé dans un ciel infernal, une miraculeuse aurore. J'ai vu parfois au fond de théâtre banal un être qui n'était que lumière or aiguise, terrasser renommé s'étend, mais mon cœur que jamais ne visitait l'ecstasy, et un théâtre où l'on atteint. Toujours en vain l'être aux ailes dégaise. George Saintsbury thus sums up the differences between Poe and Baudelaire. Both authors, Poe and De Quincey, fell short of Baudelaire himself as regards depth and fullness of passion, but both have a superficial likeness to him, in eccentricity of temperament, and affection for a certain peculiar mixture of grotesque and horror. Poe is without passion except a passion for the macabre, what Heisman calls the October of the sensations, whereas there is a gulf of despair and terror in humanity in Baudelaire, which shakes your nerves, yet stimulates the imagination. However profounder as a poet, he was no match for Poe in what might be termed intellectual prestidigitation. The mathematical Poe, the Poe of the ingenious detective tales, tales extraordinary, the Poe of the swift flights into the cosmic blue, the Poe the prophet and mystic. In these the American was more versatile than his French translator. That Baudelaire said, "Evil be thou my good," is doubtless true. He proved all things and found them vanity. He is the poet of original sin, a worshipper of Satan for the sake of paradox. His litanies to Satan ring childish to us. In his heart he was a believer. His was an infinite reverse aspiration, and mixed up with his pose was a disgust for vice, for life itself. He was the last of the Romanticists. Saint Beuve called him the Kamchatka of Romanticism, its remotest Hyperborean peak. Romanticism is dead today, as dead as naturalism, but Baudelaire is alive and red. His glistening phosphorescent trail is over French poetry, and he is the begetter of a school. Verlaine, Villiers de l'Isle Adam, Carducci, Arthur Rimbaud, Jules Laforge, Gabriel D'Annunzio, Aubrey Beardsley, Verhaeren, and many of the youthful crew. He affected Swinburne, and in Huysmans, who is not a poet, his splenetic spirit lives. Baudelaire's motto might be the obverse of Browning's lines, "The devil is in heaven, all's wrong with the world." When Goethe said of Hugo and the Romanticists that they came from Chateaubriand, he should have substituted the name of Rousseau. "Romanticism, it is Rousseau," exclaims Pierre Lasserre. But there is more of Byron in Petrus Borel, a forgotten half-mad poet in Baudelaire, though for a brief period in 1848 he became a Rousseau reactionary, sported the working man's blouse, cut his hair, shouldered a musket, went to the barricades, wrote inflammatory editorials calling the proletarian brother, oh Baudelaire, and as the Goncourt recorded in their diary, had the head of a maniac. How seriously we may take this swing of the pendulum is to be noted in a speech of the poet's at the time of the Revolution. "Come," he said, "let us go shoot General Opic." It was his stepfather that he thought of, not the eternal principles of liberty. This may be a false anecdote, many such were foisted upon Baudelaire. For example, his exclamations at cafes or in public places, such as, "Have you ever eaten a baby? I find it pleasing to the palate," or "The night I killed my father." Naturally, people stared, and Baudelaire was happy. He had startled a bourgeois. The cannibalistic idea he may have borrowed from Swift's amusing pamphlet, for this French poet knew English literature. Gautier compares the poems to a certain tale of Hawthorne's in which there is a garden of poisoned flowers. But Hawthorne worked in his laboratory of evil wearing mask and gloves. He never descended into the mud and sin of the street. Baudelaire ruined his health, smudged his soul, yet remained withal, as Anatole France says, a divine poet. How childish, yet how touching is his resolution. He wrote in his Diary of Prayer's dynamic force, when he was penniless, in debt, threatened with imprisonment, sick, nauseated with sin, to make every morning my prayer to God, the reservoir of all force and all justice to my father, to Mariette, and to Poe as intercessors. Evidently Maurice Barré encountered here his theory of intercessors. Baudelaire loved the memory of his father as much as Stendhal hated his own. He became reconciled with his mother after the death of General Opic in 1857. He felt in 1862 that his own intellectual eclipse was approaching, for he wrote, "I have cultivated my hysteria with joy and terror. Today imbecility's wing fanned me as it passed." The sense of the vertiginous gulf was abiding with him, read his poem, Pascal avait son gouffre. In preferring the Baudelaire translations of Poe to the original, and they give the impression of being original works, Stedman agreed with Asselineau that the French is more concise than the English. The prose of Poe and Baudelaire is clear, sober, rhythmic. Baudelaire's is more lapidary, finer in contour, richer colored, more supple, though without the honey and tiger's blood of Barbey d'Aurevilly. Baudelaire's soul was patiently built up as a fabulous bird might build its nest. Bits of straw, the sobbing of women, clay, cascades of black stars, rags, leaves, rotten wood, corroding dreams, a spray of roses, a sparkle of pebble, a gleam of blue sky, arabesques of incense and verdigris, despairing hearts and music and the abomination of desolation for its ground tones. But this soul nest is also a cemetery of the seven sorrows. He loves the clouds, les nuages, la basse. It was la basse with him, even in the tortures of his wretched love life. Corruption and death were ever floating in his consciousness. He was like Flaubert, who saw everywhere the hidden skeleton. Félicien Hoppe has best interpreted Baudelaire. The etcher and poet were closely knit spirits. Rodin, too, is a Baudelarian. If there could be such an anomaly as a native woodnote wildly evil, it would be the lyric and astringent voice of this poet. His sensibility was both Catholic and morbid, though he could be frigid in the face of the most disconcerting misfortunes. He was a man for whom the invisible word existed. If Gautier was pagan, Baudelaire was a strayed spirit from medieval days. The spirit rules, and, as Paul Bourget said, he saw God. A Manichaean in his worship of evil, he nevertheless abased his soul. "O Lord God, give me the force and courage to contemplate my heart and my body without disgust." He prays, but as someone remarked to Roquefoucauld, "Where you end, Christianity begins." Baudelaire built his ivory tower on the borders of a poetic marima, which every miasma of the spirit pervaded, every marshlight and glowworm inhabited. Like Wagner, Baudelaire painted in his sultry music the profundities of abysms, the vastness of space. He painted, too, the great nocturnal silences of the soul. Pacem summum tenet. He never reached peace on the heights. Let us admit that souls of his kind are encased in sick frames. Their steel is too shrewd for the scabbard. Yet the enigma for us is none the less unfathomable. Existence for such natures is a sort of muffled delirium. To affiliate him with Poe, De Quincey, Hoffman, James Thomson, Coleridge, and the rest of the somber choir does not explain him. He is perhaps nearer Donne and Villon than any of the others. Strains of the metaphysical and sinister and super-subtle are to be discovered in him. The disharmony of brain and body, the spiritual bilocation, are only too easy to diagnose. But the remedy? Hypocrite lecture, mon semblable, mon frère. And the subtlety, force, grandeur of his poetic production to be considered, together with its disquieting, nervous, vibrating qualities, it is not surprising that Victor Hugo wrote to the poet, "You invest the heaven of art with we know not what deadly rays. You create a new shudder." Hugo might have said that he turned art into an inferno. Baudelaire is the evil archangel of poetry. In his heaven of fire, glass and ebony, he is the blazing Lucifer. A glorious devil, large in heart and brain, that did love beauty only, once sang Tennyson, though not of the Frenchman. 2. As long ago as 1869, and in our barbarous gaslit country, as Baudelaire named the land of Poe, an unsigned review appeared in which this poet was described as unique and as interesting as Hamlet. He is that rare and unknown being, a genuine poet, a poet in the midst of things that have disordered his spirit, a poet excessively developed in his taste for and by beauty, very responsive to the ideal, very greedy of sensation. A better description of Baudelaire does not exist. The Hamlet motive, particularly, is one that sounded throughout the disordered symphony of the poet's life. He was later revealed, also reviled, to American readers by Henry James, who completely missed his significance. This was in 1878, when appeared the first edition of French Poets and Novelists. Previous to that, there had been some desultory discussion, a few essays in the magazines, and in 1875, a sympathetic paper by Professor James Albert Harrison of the University of Virginia. He denounced the Frenchman for his reprehensible taste, though he did not mention his beautiful verse, nor his originality in the matter of criticism. Baudelaire, in his eyes, was not only immoral, but he had, with the approbation of Sainte-Beuve, introduced Poe as a great man to the French nation. See Baudelaire's letter to Sainte-Beuve in the newly published Letters, 1841 to 1866. Perhaps Mr. Dick Minim, in his projected Academy of Criticism, might make clear these devious problems. The Études critiques of Edmond Chéret were collected in 1863. In them we find this unhappy, uncritical judgment. Baudelaire, lui, n'a rien, ni le cœur, ni l'esprit, ni la vie, ni le mot, ni la raison, ni la fantaisie, ni la verve, ni la même la facture. Son unique titre, c'est d'avoir contribué à créer l'esthétique de la débauche. It is not our intention to dilate upon the injustice of this criticism. It is Baudelaire, the critic of aesthetics, in whom we are interested. Yet I cannot forbear saying that if all the negations of Chéret had been transformed into affirmations, only justice would have been accorded Baudelaire, who was not alone a poet, the most original of his century, but also a critic of the first rank, one who welcomed Richard Wagner when Paris hooted him, and his fellow composer, Hector Berlioz, played with the role of the envious, one who fought for Edouard Manet, Leconte de Lille, Gustave Flaubert, Eugène Delacroix, fought with pen for the modern etchers, illustrators, Marion, Daumier, Félicien Roth, Gavarni, and Constantine Guy. He literally identified himself with De Quincey and Poe, translating them so wonderfully well that some unpatriotic persons liked the French better than the originals. So much was Baudelaire absorbed in Poe that a writer of his times asserted that the translator would meet the same fate as the American poet. A singular vigorous spirit is Baudelaire's, whose poetry with its icy ecstasy is profound and harmonious, whose criticism is penetrated by a Catholic quality, who anticipated modern critics in his abhorrence of schools and environments, preferring to isolate the man and uniquely study him. He would have subscribed to Swinburne's generous pronouncement, I've never been able to see what should attract man to the profession of criticism but the noble pleasure of praising. The Frenchman has said that it would be impossible for a critic to become poet, and it is impossible for a poet not to contain a critic. Théophile Gautier's study, prefixed to the definitive edition of Les Fleurs de Mal, is not only the most sympathetic exposition of Baudelaire as man and genius, but it is also the high watermark of Gautier's gifts as a critical essayist. We learn therein how the young Charles, an incorrigible dandy, came to visit Hôtel Pimodan about 1844. In this Hôtel Pimodan, a dilettante, Ferdinand Boissard, held high revel. His fantastically decorated apartments were frequented by the painters, poets, sculptors, romancers of the day. That is, carefully selected ones, such as Liszt, George Sand, Mérimée, and others whose verve or genius gave them the privilege of saying "Open Sesame" to this cave of 40 supermen. Balzac had his Peau de Chagrin pictured the same sort of scenes which were supposed to occur weekly at the Pimodan. Gautier eloquently describes the meeting of these kindred artistic souls, where the beautiful Jewess, Merinx, who had posed for Ari Scheffer's Mignon and for Paul Delaroche Langlois, met the superb Madame Sabatier, the only woman that Baudelaire loved, and the original of that extraordinary group of Clésingers, the sculptor and son-in-law of George Sand. La femme au serpent, a salambo à la mode in marble. Hashish was eaten, so Gautier writes, by Boissard and Baudelaire. As for the creator of Mademoiselle Maupin, he was too robust for such nonsense. He had to work for his living at journalism, and he died in harness, an irreproachable father, while the unhappy Baudelaire, the inheritor of an intense, unstable temperament, soon devoured his patrimony of 75,000 francs, and for the remaining years of his life was between the devil of his dusky Jenny Duval and the deep sea of hopeless debt. It was at these Pimodan gatherings, which were no doubt much less wicked than the participants would have us believe, that Baudelaire encountered Émile Deroy, a painter of skill who made his portrait, and encouraged the fashionable young fellow to continue his art studies. We have seen an album containing sketches by the poet. They betray talent of about the same order as Thackeray's, with a superadded note of the horrific, that favorite epithet of the early Poe critics. Baudelaire admired Thackeray, and when the Englishman praised the illustrations of Guy, he was delighted. Deroy taught his pupil the commonplaces of a painter's technique, also how to compose a palette, a rather meaningless phrase nowadays. At least he did not write of the arts without some technical experience. Delacroix took up his enthusiastic disciple, and when the salons of Baudelaire appeared in 1845, 46, 55, and 59, the praise and blame they evoked were testimonies to the training and knowledge of their author. A new spirit had been born. The names of Diderot and Baudelaire were coupled. Neither academic nor spouting the jargon of the usual critic, the salons of Baudelaire are the production of a humanist. Some would put them above Diderot's. Mr. Sainsbury, after Swinburne, the warmest advocate of Baudelaire among the English, thinks that the French poet in his picture criticism observed too little and imagined too much. In other words, he adds, to read a criticism of Baudelaire's without the title affixed is by no means a sure method of recognizing the picture afterward. Now, word-painting was the very thing that Baudelaire avoided. It was his friend Gautier, with the plastic style, who attempted well-nigh impossible feat of competing in his verbal descriptions with the certitudes of canvas and marble. And if he, with his verbal imagination, did not entirely succeed, how could a less adept manipulator of the vocabulary? We do not agree with Mr. Sainsbury. No one can imagine too much when the imagination is that of a poet. Baudelaire divined the work of the artist and set it down scrupulously in a prose of exceeding rectitude. He did not paint pictures in prose. He did not divagate. He did not overburden his pages with technical terms. But the spirit of his subject he did disengage in a few swift phrases. The polemics of historical schools were a cross for him to bear, and he wore his prejudices lightly. Like a true critic, he judged more by form than theme. There are no types, there is only life, he asserted, and long before Jules Laforge. He was ever art for art, yet having breadth of comprehension and a hind-like capacity for seeing both sides of his own nature with its idiosyncrasies. He could write, "The puerile utopia of the school of art for art, in excluding morality and often even passion, was necessarily sterile. All literature which refuses to advance fraternally between science and philosophy is a homicidal and suicidal literature." Baudelaire, then, was no less sound a critic of the plastic arts than of music and literature. Like his friend Flaubert, he had a horror of democracy. of the democratization of the arts, of all the sentimental fuss and fuddle of a pseudo-humanitarianism. During the 1848 agitation, the former dandy of 1840 put on a blouse and spoke of barricades. Those things were in the air. Wagner rang the alarm bells during the Dresden uprising. Chopin wrote for the pianoforte a revolutionary etude. Brave lads, poets and musicians fight their battles best in the region of the ideal. Baudelaire's little attack of the equality measles soon vanished. He lectured his brother poets and artists on the folly and injustice of abusing or despising the bourgeois. Being a man of paradox, he dedicated a volume of his salons to the bourgeois. But he would not have contradicted Mr. George Moore for declaring that in art the Democrat is always reactionary. In 1830 the Democrats were against Victor Hugo and Delacroix. And Le Fleur de Mal, that book of opals, blood, and evil swamp flowers, will never be savored by the mob. In his Souvenir de Jeunesse, Champfleury speaks of the promenades in the Louvre. He enjoys the company with Baudelaire. Bronzino was one of the poet's preferences. He was also attracted by El Greco, not an unusual admiration considering the somber extravagance of his own genius. Of Goya he has written in exalted phrases. Velázquez was his touchstone, being of a perverse nature, his d'Oeuvre ruined by abuse of drink and drugs. The landscapes of his imagination were more beautiful than nature herself. The country itself, he declared, was odious, like Whistler, whom he often met. See the Hommage à Delacroix by Fontaine-Latour, with its portraits of Whistler, Baudelaire, Manet, Bracquemont, the etcher Legros, Delacroix, Cordier, Doranty the critic, and de Balleroy. He could not help showing his aversion to foolish sunsets. In a word, Baudelaire, into whose brain had entered too much moonlight, was the father of a lunar school of poetry, criticism, and fiction. His Samuel Kramer in La Fanfarlo is the literary progenitor of Jean, Duc de Saint, in Huysmans' A Reborn. Huysmans at first modeled himself upon Baudelaire. His Le Drageois aux Épices is a continuation of Petit Poème en Prose, and to Baudelaire's account must be laid much artificial morbid writing. Despite his pursuit of perfection in form, his influence has been too often baneful to impressionable artists in embryo. A lover of Gallic Byronism and high priest of the Satanic school, there was no extravagance, absurd or terrible, that he did not commit, from etching a 4-part fugue on ice to skating hymns in honor of Lucifer. In his criticism alone was he the sane, logical Frenchman, and while he did not live to see the success of the Impressionist group, he surely would have acclaimed their theory and practice. Was he not an Impressionist himself? As Richard Wagner was his god in music, so Delacroix quite overflowed his aesthetic consciousness. Read Volume 2 of his collected works, Curiosité Esthétique, which contains his Silence, also his essay De l'essence de rire, worthy to be placed side by side with George Meredith's essay on comedy. Caricaturists, French and foreign, are considered in 2 chapters at the close of the volume. Baudelaire was as conscientious as Gautier. He trotted around miles of mediocre canvas, saying an encouraging word to the less talented, boiling over with holy indignation or indulging in glacial irony before the rash usurpers occupying the seats of the mighty and pouncing on new genius with promptitude. Upon Delacroix he lavished the largesse of his admiration. He smiled at the platitudes of Horace Vernet, and only shook his head over the Schnetzes and other artisans of the day. He welcomed William Hosselier, now so little known. He praised de Verrier, Chassériau, who waited years before he came into his own. His preferred landscapists were Corot, Rousseau, and Troyon. He impolitely spoke of Ary Scheffer and the apes of sentiment, while his discussions of Hogarth, Cruikshank, Pinelli, and Bruegel proclaims his versatility of vision. In his essay, Le Peintre de la Vie Moderne, he was the first among critics to recognize the peculiar quality called modernity, that naked vibration which informs the novels of Goncourt, Flaubert's L'Education Sentimentale, and the pictures of Manet, Monet, Degas, and Raphael, with their evocations of a new nervous Paris. It is in his Volume 3, entitled L'Art Romantique, that so many things dear to the new century were then subjects of furious quarrels. This book contains much just and brilliant writing. It was easy for Nietzsche to praise Wagner in Germany in 1876, but dangerous at Paris in 1861 to declare war on Wagner's adverse critics. This Baudelaire did. The relations of Baudelaire and Edouard Manet were exceedingly cordial. In a letter to Théophile Thoré, The Art Critic, Letters, page 361, we find Baudelaire defending his friend from the accusation that his pictures were pastiches of Goya. He wrote, "Manet has never seen Goya, never El Greco. He was never in Portale Galerie," which may have been true at the time, 1864. Nevertheless, Manet had visited Madrid and spent much time studying Velázquez and abusing Spanish cookery. Consider, too, Goya's balcony with girls and Manet's famous balcony. Raging at the charge of imitation, Baudelaire said in this same epistle, "They accuse even me of imitating Edgar Poe. Do you know why I so patiently translated Poe? Because he resembled me." The poet italicized these words. With stupefaction, therefore, he admired the mysterious coincidences of Manet's work with that of Goya and El Greco. He took Manet seriously. He wrote to him in a paternal and severe tone. Recall his reproof when urging the painter to exhibit his work. "You complain about attacks, but are you the first to endure them? Have you more genius than Chateaubriand and Wagner? They were not killed by derision, and in order not to make you too proud, I must tell you that they are models, each in his way, and in a very rich world, while you are only the first in the decrepitude of your art." Letters, page 436. Would Baudelaire recall these prophetic words if he were able to revisit the glimpses of the Champs-Élysées at the Autumn Salon? What would he think of Cézanne? Odilon Redon he would understand, for he is the transposer of Baudelaireanism to terms of design and color, and perhaps the poet whose verse is saturated with tropical hues, he, when young, sailed in southern seas, might appreciate the monstrous debauch of form and color in the Tahitian canvases of Paul Gauguin. Baudelaire's preoccupation with pictorial themes may be noted in his verse. He is par excellence the poet of aesthetics. To Daumier he inscribed a poem, and to the sculptor Ernest Christophe, to Delacroix, Certas en présent, to Manet, to Guy, Rêve parisien, to an unknown master, Un Mater, and Watteau. A Watteau a Ribon is seen in Un Voyage citer, while in Les Fers this poet of the ideal, spleen, music, and perfume shows his adoration for Rubens, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Puget, Goya, Delacroix. Delacroix, Lac de sang hanté des mauvais anges. And what is more exquisite than his quatrain to Lola de Valence, a poetic inscription for the picture of Edouard Manet, with its last line as vaporous, as subtle as Verlaine. Le charme inattendu d'un bijou rose et noir. Heine called himself the last of the Romantics. The first of the moderns and the last of the Romantics was the many-sided Charles Baudelaire. 3. He was born at Paris, April 9, 1821, Flaubert's birth year, and not April 21st, as Gautier has it. His father was Joseph Francis Baudelaire, or Baudelaire, who occupied a government position. A cultivated art lover, his taste was apparent in the home he made for his second wife, Caroline Archimbaud Dufay, an orphan and the daughter of a military officer. There was a considerable difference in the years of this pair. The mother was 27, the father 62, at the birth of their only child. By his first marriage, the elder Baudelaire had one son, Claude, who, like his half-brother Charles, died of paralysis, though a steady man of business. That great modern neurosis, called commerce, has its mental wrecks too, and no one pays attention. But when a poet falls by the wayside is the chase begun by neurologists and other soul hunters seeking victims. After the death of Baudelaire's father, the widow, within a year, married the handsome, ambitious Opique, then chef bataillon, lieutenant colonel, decorated with the Legion of Honor, and later general and ambassador to Madrid, Constantinople, and London. Charles was a nervous, frail youth, but unlike most children of genius, he was a scholar and won brilliant honors at school. His stepfather was proud of him. From the Royal College of Lyon, Charles went to the Lycée Louis le Grand, Paris, but was expelled in 1839 on various discreditable charges. Troubles soon began at home. He was irascible, vain, precocious, and given to dissipation. He quarreled with General Opique, and disdained his mother. But she was to blame, she had confessed. She had quite forgotten the boy in the flush of her second love. He could not forget or forgive what he called her infidelity to the memory of his father. Hamlet-like, he was inconsolable. The good Bishop of Montpellier, who knew the family, said that Charles was a little crazy. Second marriages usually bring woe in their train. When a mother has such a son, she doesn't remarry, said the young poet. Charles signed himself Baudelaire Dufay, or sometimes Dufay. He wrote in his journal, "My ancestors, idiots or maniacs, all victims of terrible passions," which was one of his exaggerations. His grandfather on the paternal side was a Champenois peasant, his mother's family presumably Norman, but not much is known of her forebears. Charles believed himself lost from the time his half-brother was stricken. He also believed that his instability of temperament, and he studied his case as would a surgeon, was the result of his parents' disparity in years. After his return from the East, where he did not learn English as has been said, his mother taught him as a boy to converse in and write the language. He came into his little inheritance, about $15,000. 2 years later he was so heavily in debt that his family asked for a guardian on the ground of incompetency. He had been swindled, being young and green. How had he squandered his money? Not exactly on opera glasses, like Gérard de Nerval, but on clothes, pictures, furniture, books. The remnant was set aside to pay his debts. Charles would be both poet and dandy. He dressed expensively, but soberly, in the English fashion. His linen dazzling, the prevailing hue of his habiliments black. In height he was medium, his eyes brown, searching, luminous, the eye of a nyctalops, eyes like ravens, nostrils palpitating, cleft chin, mouth expressive, sensual, jaw strong and square. His hair was black, curly, glossy, his forehead high, square, and white. In the Duroy portrait he wears a beard. He is there what Catulle Mendes nicknamed him, His Excellence Monseigneur Brummel. Later he was the elegiac Satan, the author of L'Imitation de Inès le Diable, or the Baudelaire of George Moore. The clean-shaven face of the mock priest, the slow, cold eyes, and the sharp, cunning sneer of the cynical libertine, who will be tempted that he may better know the worthlessness of temptation. In the heyday of his blood he was perverse and deliberate. Let us credit him with contradicting the Byronic notion that ennui could best be cured by dissipation. In sin, Baudelaire found the saddest of all consolations. Mende laughs at the legend of Baudelaire's violence, of his being given to explosive phrases. Despite Gautier's stories about the Hôtel Pimadin and its club of hashish eaters, Monsieur Mende denies that Baudelaire was a victim of the hemp. What the majority of mankind does not know concerning the habits of literary workers is this prime fact: men who work hard, writing verse, and there is no mental toil comparable to it, cannot drink or indulge in opium without inevitable collapse. The old-fashioned ideas of inspiration, spontaneity, easy improvisation, the sudden bolt from heaven, are delusions still hugged by the world. To be told that Chopin filed at his music for years, that Beethoven in his smithy forged his thunderbolts by the sweat of his brow, that Manet toiled like a laborer on the dock, that Baudelaire was a mechanic in his devotion to poetic work, that Gautier was a hard-working journalist, are disillusions for the sentimental. Minerva springing full-fledged from Jupiter's skull to the desk of the poet is a pretty fancy, but Balzac and Flaubert did not encourage this fancy. Work literally killed Poe, as it literally killed Jules de Concord, Flaubert, and Daudet. Maupassant went insane because he would work and he would play the same day. Baudelaire worked and worried. His debts haunted him his life long. His constitution was flawed. Sainte-Beuve told him that he had worn out his nerves. From the start he was détraqué, but that his entire life was one huge debauch is a nightmare of the moral police in some red-cotton nightcap country. His period of mental production was not brief nor barren. He was a student. Duchamp's charge that he was an ignorant man is disproved by the variety and quality of his published work. His range of sympathies was large. His mistake, in the eyes of his colleagues, was to write so well about the 7 arts. Versatility is seldom given its real name, which is protracted labor. Baudelaire was one of the elect, an aristocrat who dealt with the quintessence of art. His delicate air of a bishop, his exquisite manners, his modulated voice, aroused unusual interest and admiration. He was a humanist of distinction. He has left a hymn to St. Francis in the Latin of the Decadence. Baudelaire, like Chopin, made more poignant the phrase, raised to a higher intensity, the expressiveness of art. Women played a commanding role in his life. They always do with any poet worthy of the name, though few have been so frank in acknowledging this as Baudelaire. Yet he was in love more with woman than the individual. The legend of the beautiful creature he brought from the East resolves itself into the dismal affair with Jeanne Duval. He met her in Paris after he had been in the East. She sang at a café concert in Paris, She was more brown than black. She was not handsome, not intelligent, not good, yet he idealized her, for she was the source of half his inspiration. To her were addressed those marvelous evocations of the Orient, of perfume, tresses, delicious dawns on strange faraway seas, and superb Byzant domes that devils built. Baudelaire is the poet of perfumes. He is also the patron saint of ennui. No one has so chanted the praise of odors. His soul swims on perfume, as do other souls on music. He has sung. As he grew older, he seemed to hunt for more acrid odors. He often presents an elaborately chased vase, the carving of which transports us, but from which the head is quickly averted. Jeanne, whom he never loved, no matter what may be said, was a sorceress. But she was impossible. She robbed, betrayed him. He left her a dozen times only to return. He was a capital draftsman, with a strong nervous line, and made many pen and ink drawings of her. They are not prepossessing. In her rapid decline she was not allowed to want. Madame Aupic paid her expenses in the hospital, a sordid history. She was a veritable flower of evil for Baudelaire, yet poetry, like music, would be colorless, scentless, if it sounded no dissonances. Fancy art reduced to the beatific and banal chord of C major. He fell in love with the celebrated Madame Sabatier, a reigning beauty, at whose salon artistic Paris assembled. She had been christened by Gautier Madame la Présidente, and her sumptuous beauty was portrayed by Ricard in his La Femme aux Chiens. She returned Baudelaire's love. They soon parted. Again a riddle which the published letters hardly solve. One letter, however, does show that Baudelaire had tried to be faithful and failed. He could not extort from his exhausted soul the sentiment, but he put its music on paper. His most seductive lyrics were addressed to Madame Sabatier. À la très chère, à la très belle, a hymn saturated with love, music, spleen, perfumes. Color, sound, perfumes call to each other as deep to deep. Perfumes like the flesh of children, soft as hot boys, green as the meadows. Criminals, outcasts, the charm of childhood, the horrors of love, pride and rebellion, eastern landscapes, cats, soothing and false, cats, the true companions of lonely poets, haunted clocks, shivering dusks and gloomier dawns, Paris in 100 phases. These and many other themes this strange-souled poet, this Dante, pacer of the shore of Paris, has celebrated in finely wrought verse and profound phrases. In a single line he contrives atmosphere. The very shape of his sentence, the ring of the syllables, arouse the deepest emotion. A master of harmonic undertones is Baudelaire. His successors have excelled him in making their music more fluid, more lyrical, more vaporous. Many young French poets pass through their Baudelairean green sickness, but he alone knows the secrets of molding those metallic, free sonnets, which have the resistance of bronze, and of the despairing music that flames from the mouths of lost souls trembling on the wharves of hell. He is the supreme master of irony and troubled voluptuousness. Baudelaire is a masculine poet. He carved rather than sang. The plastic arts spoke to his soul. A lover and maker of images, like Poe, his emotions transformed themselves into ideas. Bourget classified him as mystic, libertine, and analyst. He was born with a wound in his soul, to use the phrase of Père Lacordaire. Curiously enough, he actually contemplated in 1861 becoming a candidate for Lacordaire's vacant seat in the French Academy. Sainte-Beuve dissuaded him from this folly. Recall Baudelaire's prayer. Thou, O Lord, my God, grant me the grace to produce some fine lines which will prove to myself that I am not the last of men, that I am not inferior to those I contemn. Individualist, egoist, anarchist, his only thoughts were his letters. Jules Laforge thus described Baudelaire: cat, Hindu, Yankee, Episcopal, alchemist. Yes, an alchemist who suffocated in the fumes he created. He was of Gothic imagination, and could have said with Rolla, Je suis venu trop tard dans un monde trop vieux. He had an unassuaged thirst for the absolute. The human soul was his stage, he its interpreting orchestra. In 1857, The Flowers of Evil was published by Poulet Malassis, who afterward went into bankruptcy, a warning to publishers with a taste for fine literature. The titles contemplated were Limbs or Lesbiennes. Hippolyte Babou suggested the one we know. These poems were suppressed on account of 6, and poet and publisher summoned. As the municipal government had made a particular ass of itself in the prosecution of Gustave Flaubert and his Madame Bovary, the Baudelaire matter was disposed of in haste. He was condemned to a fine of 300 francs, a fine which was never paid, as the objectionable poems were removed. They were printed in the Belgian edition, and may be read in the new volume, Œuvres Posthumes. Baudelaire was infuriated over the judgment, for he knew that his book was dramatic in expression. He had expected, like Flaubert, to emerge from the trial with flying colors. Therefore, to be classed as one who wrote objectionable literature was a shock. Flaubert had the Empress back of him, he complained, which was true. The Empress Eugénie, also the Princess Mathilde. But he worked as ever and put forth those polished intaglios called poems in prose, for the form of which he had taken a hint from Alois Bertrand's Gaspard de la Nuit. He filled this form with a new content. Not alone pictures, but moods are to be found in those miniatures. Pity is their keynote, a tenderness for the abject and lowly, a revelation of sensibility that surprised those critics who had discerned in Baudelaire only a sculptor of evil. In one of his poems he described a landscape of metal, of marble and water, a babel of staircases and arcades, a palace of infinity surrounded by the silence of eternity. This depressing yet magical dream was utilized by Huysman in his A Rebord. But in the tiny landscapes of the prose poems there is nothing rigid or artificial. Indeed, the poet's deliberate attitude of artificiality is dropped. He is human. Not that the deep fundamental note of humanity is ever absent in his poems. The eternal diapason is there even when least overheard. Baudelaire is more human than Poe. His range of sympathy is wider. In this he transcends him as a poet, though his subject matter often issues from the very dregs of life. Brother to pitiable wanderers, there are, nevertheless, no traces of Kant, no Russian pity a la Dostoevsky, no humanitarian or socialistic rhapsodies in his work. Baudelaire is an egoist. He hated the sentimental sapping of altruism. His prose poem, Crowds, with its bath of multitude, may have been suggested by Poe, but in Charles Lamb we find the idea, are there no solitudes out of caves in the desert, or cannot the heart, in the midst of crowds, feel frightfully alone? His best critical work is the Richard Wagner and Tannhauser, as significant an essay in Nietzsche's Richard Wagner and Bayreuth. And Baudelaire's polemic appeared at a more critical period in Wagner's career. Wagner sent a brief, hearty letter of thanks to the critic and later made his acquaintance. To Wagner, Baudelaire introduced a young Wagnerian, Villiers de l'Isle Adam. This Wagner letter is included in the volume of Crapet, but there are no letters published from Baudelaire to Franz Liszt, though they were friends. In Weimar, I saw at the Liszt Museum several from Baudelaire which should have been included in the letters. The poet understood Liszt, and his reforms as he understood Wagner. The German composer admired the French poet, and his Kundry, in the sultry second act of Parsifal, had a Baudelairean hue, especially in the temptation scene. The end was at hand. Baudelaire had been steadily, rather unsteadily, going downhill. A desperate figure, a dandy in shabby attire. He went out only after dark. He haunted the exterior boulevards, associated with birds of nocturnal plumage. He drank without thirst, ate without hunger, as he had said. A woeful decadence for this aristocrat of life and letters. Most sorrowful of sinners, a morose delectation scourged his nerves and extorted the darkest music from his lyre. He fled to Brussels, there to rehabilitate his dwindling fortunes. He gave a few lectures and met Rope, Lemonnier, drank to forget and forgot to work. He abused Brussels, Belgium, its people. A country, he cried, where the trees are black, the flowers without odor, and where there is no conversation. He, the brilliant causeur, the chief blagueur of a circle in which young James McNeill Whistler was reduced to the role of a listener. This most spiritual among artists found himself a failure in the Belgian capital. It may not be amiss to remind ourselves that Baudelaire was the creator of many of the paradoxes attributed not only to Whistler but to an entire school, if one may employ such a phrase. The frozen imperturbability of the poet, his cutting enunciation, his power of blasphemy, his hatred of nature, his love of the artificial, have been copied by the aesthetic blades of our day. He it was who first taunted nature with being an imitator of art, with always being the same. Oh, the imitative sunsets! Oh, the quotidian eating and drinking! And as pessimist, too, he led the mode. Baudelaire, like Flaubert, grasped the murky torch of pessimism once held by Chateaubriand Benjamin Constant, and Sinecure. Doubtless all this stemmed from Byronism, and now it is as stale as Byronism. His health failed, and he lacked money enough to pay for doctors' prescriptions. He even owed for the room in his hotel. At Namur, where he was visiting his father-in-law of Felicia and Rope, March 1866, he suffered from an attack of paralysis. He was removed to Brussels. His mother, who lived at Aulnoy in mourning for her husband, came to his aid. Taken to France, he was placed in a sanatorium. Aphasia set in. He could only ejaculate a mild oath, and when he caught sight of himself in the mirror, he would bow pleasantly as if to a stranger. His friends rallied, and they were among the most distinguished people in Paris, the elite of souls. Ladies visited him, one or two playing Wagner on the piano, which must have added a fresh nuance to death, and they brought him flowers. He expressed his love for flowers and music to the last. He could not bear the sight of his mother. She revived in him some painful memories, but that passed, and he clamored for her when she was absent. If anyone mentioned the names of Wagner or Manet, he smiled, and with a fixed stare as if peering through some invisible window opening upon eternity, he died, August 31st, 1867, age 46. Barbé de Révely, himself a Satanist and dandy, oh, those comical old attitudes of literature, had prophesied that the author of Fleur de Mal would either blow out his brains or prostrate himself at the foot of the cross. Later he said the same of Huysman. Baudelaire had the alternative course forced upon him by fate after he had attempted spiritual suicide for how many years? He once tried actual suicide, but the slight cut in his throat looked so ugly to him that he went no farther. His soul had been a battlefield for the powers of good and evil. That at the end he brought the wreck of both soul and body to his God should not be a subject for comment. He was an extraordinary poet with a bad conscience, who lived miserably and was buried with honors. Then it was that his worth was discovered. Funeral orations over a genius are a species of public staircase wit. His reputation waxes with the years. He is an exotic gem in the crown of French poetry. Of him Swinburne has chanted, Ave atque val. Shall I strew on thee rose or rue or laurel? Brother, on this that was the veil of thee. End of section 0. Section 1 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stranger. Tell me, enigmatic man, whom do you love best? Your father, your mother, your sister, or your brother? I have neither father, nor mother, nor sister, nor brother. Your friends, then? You use a word that until now has had no meaning for me. Your country? I am ignorant of the latitude in which it is situated. Then beauty. Her I would love willingly, goddess and immortal. Gold? I hate it as you hate your God. What then, extraordinary stranger, do you love? I love the clouds that pass yonder, the marvelous clouds. End of section 1. Section 2 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Every Man His Chimæra. Beneath a broad gray sky, upon a vast and dusty plain devoid of grass, and where not even a nettle or a thistle was to be seen, I met several men who walked bowed down to the ground. Each one carried upon his back an enormous chimera, as heavy as a sack of flour or coal, or as the equipment of a Roman foot soldier. But the monstrous beast was not a dead weight. Rather, she enveloped and oppressed the men with her powerful and elastic muscles, and clawed with her 2 vast talons at the breast of her mount. Her fabulous head reposed upon the brow of the man, like one of those horrible casques by which ancient warriors hoped to add to the terrors of the enemy. I questioned one of the men, asking him why they went so. He replied that he knew nothing, neither he nor the others, but that evidently they went somewhere, since they were urged on by an unconquerable desire to walk. Very curiously, none of the wayfarers seemed to be irritated by the ferocious beast hanging at his neck and cleaving to his back. One had said that he considered it as a part of himself. These grave and weary faces bore witness to no despair. Beneath the splenetic cupola of the heavens, their feet trudging through the dust of an earth as desolate as the sky, they journeyed onwards with the resigned faces of men condemned to hope forever. So the train passed me and faded into the atmosphere of the horizon, at the place where the planet unveils herself to the curiosity of the human eye. During several moments I obstinately endeavored to comprehend this mystery, but irresistible indifference soon threw herself upon me, nor was I more heavily dejected thereby than they by their crushing chimeras. End of section 2. Section 3 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Venus and the Fool. How admirable of the day! The vast park swoons beneath the burning eye of the sun, as youth beneath the lordship of love. There is no rumor of the universal ecstasy of all things. The waters themselves are as though drifting into sleep. Very different from the festivals of humanity, here is a silent revel. It seems as though an ever-waning light makes all objects glimmer more and more, as though the excited flowers burn with a desire to rival the blue of the sky by the vividness of their colors, as though the heat, making perfumes visible, drives them in vapor towards their star. Yet, in the midst of this universal joy, I have perceived one afflicted thing. At the feet of a colossal Venus, one of those motley fools, those willing clowns whose business it is to bring laughter upon kings when weariness or remorse possesses them, lies wrapped in his gaudy and ridiculous garments, coined with his cap and bells, huddled against the pedestal, and raises towards the goddess, his eyes filled with tears. And his eyes say, I am the last and most alone of all mortals, inferior to the meanest of animals, in that I am denied either love or friendship. Yet I am made, even I, for the understanding and enjoyment of immortal beauty. O goddess, have pity upon my sadness and my frenzy. The implacable Venus gazed into I know not what distances with her marble eyes. End of section 3. Section 4 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Intoxication. One must be forever drunken. That is the sole question of importance. If you would not feel the horrible burden of time that bruises your shoulders and bends you to the earth, you must be drunken without cease. But how? With wine, with poetry, with virtue, with what you please. But be drunken. And if sometimes on the steps of a palace, on the green grass by a moat, or in the dull loneliness of your chamber, you should waken up, your intoxication already lessened or gone, ask of the wind, of the wave, of the star, of the bird, of the timepiece. Ask of all that flees, all that sighs, all that revolves, all that sings, all that speaks. Ask of these the hour. And wind and wave and star and bird and timepiece will answer you. It is the hour to be drunken. Lest you be the martyred slaves of time, intoxicate yourselves. Be drunken without cease. With wine, with poetry, with virtue, or with what you will. End of section 4. Section 5 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Gifts of the Moon. The moon, who is caprice itself, looked in at the window as you slept in your cradle, and said to herself, I am well pleased with this child. And she softly descended her stairway of clouds, and passed through the window pane without noise. She bent over you with the supple tenderness of a mother, and laid her colors upon your face. Therefrom your eyes have remained green and your cheeks extraordinarily pale. From contemplation of your visitor, your eyes are so strangely wide, and she so tenderly wounded you upon the breast, that you have ever kept a certain readiness to tears. In the amplitude of her joy the moon filled all your chamber as with a phosphorescent air, a luminous poison. And all this living radiance thought and said, "You shall be forever under the influence of my kiss. You shall love all that loves me, and that I love. Clouds and silence and night, the vast green sea, the unformed and multitudinous waters, the place where you are not, the lover you will never know, monstrous flowers and perfumes that bring madness, cats that stretch themselves swooning upon the piano and lament with the sweet, hoarse voices of women. And you shall be loved of my lovers, courted of my courtesans. You shall be the queen of men with green eyes, whose breasts also I have wounded in my nocturnal caress. Men that love the sea, the immense green ungovernable sea, the unformed and multitudinous waters, the place where they are not, the woman they will never know. Sinister flowers that seem to bear the incense of some unknown religion. Perfumes that trouble the will, and all savage and voluptuous animals, images of their own folly. And that is why I am couched at your feet, O spoiled child, beloved and accursed, seeking in all your being the reflection of that august divinity, that prophetic godmother, that poisonous nurse of all lunatics. End of section 5. Section 6 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Invitation to the Voyage. It is a superb land, a country of cocagne, as they say, that I dream of visiting with an old friend. A strange land drowned in our northern fogs that one might call the east of the west, the China of Europe, a land patiently and luxuriously decorated with the wise, delicate vegetations of a warm and capricious fantasy. A true land of cocagne, where all is beautiful, rich, tranquil, and honest, where luxury is pleased to mirror itself in order, where life is opulent and sweet to breathe, from whence disorder, turbulence, and the unforeseen are excluded, where happiness is married to silence, where even the food is poetic, rich, and exciting at the same time, where all things, my beloved, are like you. Do you know that feverish malady that seizes hold of us in our cold miseries? That nostalgia of a land unknown, that anguish of curiosity? It is a land which resembles you, where all is beautiful, rich, tranquil, and honest, where fantasy has built and decorated an Occidental China, where life is sweet to breathe, and happiness married to silence. It is there that one would live, there that one would die. Yes, it is there that one must go to breathe, to dream, and to lengthen one's hours by an infinity of sensations. A musician has written the Invitation to the Waltz. Where is he who will write the Invitation to the Voyage, that one may offer it to his beloved, to the sister of his election? Yes, it is in this atmosphere that it would be good to live. Yonder, where slower hours contain more thoughts, where the clocks strike the hours of happiness with a more profound and significant solemnity. Upon the shining panels, or upon skins gilded with a somber opulence, beautified paintings have a discreet life, as calm and profound as the souls of the artists who created them. The setting suns that color the rooms and salons with so rich a light shine through veils of rich tapestry, or through high leaden-worked windows of many compartments. The furniture is massive, curious, and bizarre, armed with locks and secrets like profound and refined souls. The mirrors, the metals, The Aelver work and the china play a mute and mysterious symphony for the eyes, and from all things, from the corners, from the chinks in the drawers, from the folds of drapery, a singular perfume escapes, a Sumatran Revenezi, which is like the soul of the apartment. A true country of Quokania, I have said, where all is rich, correct, and shining, like a beautiful conscience or a splendid set of silver or a medley of jewels. The treasures of the world flow there, as in the house of a laborious man who has well merited the entire world. A singular land as superior to others as art is superior to nature, where nature is made over again by dream, where she is corrected, embellished, refashioned. Let them seek and seek again. Let them extend the limits of their happiness for ever, these alchemists who work with flowers. Let them offer a prize of 60 or 100,000 florins to whosoever can solve their ambitious problems. As for me, I have found my black tulip and my blue dahlia. Incomparable flower, tulip found at last, symboli cal dahlia, it is there, is it not, in this so calm and dreamy land that you blossom? Will you not there be framed in your proper analogy? And will you not be mirrored, to speak like the mystics, in your own correspondence? Dreams, always dreams, and the more ambitious and delicate the soul, the farther from possibility is the dream. Every man carries within him his dose of natural opium, incessantly secreted and renewed. And from birth to death, how many hours can we count that have been filled with positive joy, with successful and decided action? Shall we ever live in and become a part of the picture my spirit has painted, the picture that resembles you? These treasures, furnishings, luxury, order, perfumes, and miraculous flowers are you. You again are the great rivers and calm canals, the enormous ships drifting beneath their loads of riches, and musical with the sailor's monotonous song, are my thoughts that sleep and stir upon your breast. You take them gently to the sea that is infinity, reflecting the profundities of the sky in the limpid waters of your lovely soul. And when, outworn by the surge and gorged with the products of the Orient, the ships come back to the ports of home, they are still my thoughts, grown rich, that have returned to you from infinity. End of section 6. Section 7 of Little Poems and Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. What is truth? I once knew a certain Benedicta, whose presence ailed the air with the ideal, and whose eyes spread abroad the desire of grandeur, of beauty, of glory, and of all that makes man believe in immortality. But this miraculous maiden was too beautiful for long life, so she died soon after I knew her first, and it was I myself who entombed her, upon a day when spring swung her censer even in the burial ground. It was I myself who entombed her, fast closed in a coffin of perfumed wood, as uncorruptible as the coffers of India. And as my eyes rested upon the spot where my treasure lay hidden, I became suddenly aware of a little being who singularly resembled the dead, and who, stamping the newly turned earth with a curious and hysterical violence, burst into laughter and said, "It is I, the true Benedicta! It is I, the notorious drab! As the punishment of your folly and blindness, you shall love me as I truly am." But I, furious, replied no. The better to emphasize my refusal, I struck the ground so violently with my foot that my leg was thrust up to the knee in the recent grave, and I, like a wolf in a trap, was caught, perhaps forever, in the grave of the ideal. End of section 7. Section 8 of Little Poems and Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Already. 100 times already the sun had leaped, radiant or saddened, from the immense cup of the sea whose rim could scarcely be seen. 100 times it had again sunk, glittering or morose, into its mighty bath of twilight. For many days we had contemplated the other side of the firmament, and deciphered the celestial alphabet of the antipodes, and each of the passengers sighed and complained. One had said that the approach of land only exasperated their sufferings. "When, then," they said, "shall we cease to sleep a sleep broken by the surge, troubled by a wind that snores louder than we? When shall we be able to eat at an unmoving table?" There were those who thought of their own firesides, who regretted their sullen, faithless wives and their noisy progeny, all so doted upon the image of the absent land that I believe they would have eaten grass with as much enthusiasm as the beasts. At length a coast was signaled, and on approaching we saw a magnificent and dazzling land. It seemed as though the music of life flowed therefrom in a vague murmur, and the banks, rich with all kinds of growths, breathed, for leagues around, a delicious odor of flowers and fruits. Each one, therefore, was joyful. His evil humor left him. Quarrels were forgotten, reciprocal wrongs forgiven. The thought of duels was blotted out of the memory, and rancor fled away like smoke. I alone was sad, inconceivably sad. Like a priest from whom one has torn his divinity, I could not, without heartbreaking bitterness, leave this so monstrously seductive ocean, this sea so infinitely various in its terrifying simplicity, which seemed to contain in itself and represent by its joys and attractions and angers and smiles the moods and agonies and ecstasies of all souls that have lived, that live, and that shall yet live. In saying good-bye to this incomparable beauty, I felt as though I had been smitten to death, and that is why when each of my companions said, "At last," I could only cry, "Already!" Here, meanwhile, was the land with its noises, its passions, its commodities, its festivals. A land rich and magnificent, full of promises, that sent to us a mysterious perfume of rose and musk, and from whence the music of life flowed in an amorous murmuring. End of section 8. Section 9 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Double Chamber. A chamber that is like a reverie, a chamber truly spiritual, where the stagnant atmosphere is lightly touched with rose and blue. There the soul bathes itself in indolence made odorous with regret and desire. There is some sense of the twilight, of things tinged with blue and rose, a dream of delight during an eclipse. The shape of the furniture is elongated, low, languishing. One would think it endowed with the somnambulistic vitality of plants and minerals. The tapestries speak an inarticulate language, like the flowers, the skies, the dropping suns. There are no artistic abominations upon the walls. Compared with the pure dream, with an impression unanalyzed, definite art, positive art, is a blasphemy. Here all has the sufficing lucidity and the delicious obscurity of music. An infinitesimal odor of the most exquisite choice, mingled with a floating humidity, swims in this atmosphere where the drowsing spirit is lulled by the sensations one feels in a hothouse. The abundant muslin flows before the windows and the couch, and spreads out in snowy cascades. Upon the couch lies the idol, ruler of my dreams. But why is she here? Who has brought her? What magical power has installed her upon this throne of delight and reverie? What matter? She is there, and I recognize her. These indeed are the eyes whose flame pierces the twilight, the subtle and terrible mirrors that I recognize by their horrifying malice. They attract, they dominate, They devour the sight of whomsoever is imprudent enough to look at them. I have often studied them, these black stars that compel curiosity and admiration. To what benevolent demon, then, do I owe being thus surrounded with mystery, with silence, with peace, and sweet odors? O beatitude! The thing we name life, even in its most fortunate amplitude, has nothing in common with this supreme life with which I am now acquainted, which I taste minute by minute, second by second. Not so. Minutes are no more. Seconds are no more. Time has vanished, and eternity reigns, an eternity of delight. A heavy and terrible knocking reverberates upon the door, and, as in a hellish dream, it seems to me as though I had received a blow from a mattock. Then a spectre enters. It is an usher who comes to torture me in the name of the law, an infamous concubine who comes to cry misery and to add the trivialities of her life to the sorrow of mine. Or it may be the errand boy of an editor who comes to implore the remainder of a manuscript. The chamber of paradise, the idol, the ruler of dreams, the sylphide, as the great René said, all this magic has vanished at the brutal knocking of the spectre. Horror. I remember. Yes, this kennel, this habitation of eternal weariness, is indeed my own. Here is my senseless furniture, dusty and tattered, the dirty fireplace without a flame or an ember, the sad windows where the raindrops have traced runnels in the dust, the manuscripts erased or unfinished, the almanac with the sinister days marked off with a pencil. And this perfume of another world whereof I intoxicated myself with a so perfected sensitiveness, alas, its place is taken by the odor of stale tobacco smoke, mingled with I know not what nauseating mustiness. Now one breathes here the rankness of desolation. In this narrow world, narrow and yet full of disgust, a single familiar object smiles at me, the phial of laudanum, old and terrible love, like all loves, alas, fruitful in caresses and treacheries. Yes, time has reappeared. Time reigns a monarch now, and with the hideous ancient has returned all his demoniacal following of memories, regrets, tremors, fears, dolors, nightmares, and twittering nerves. I assure you that the seconds are strongly and solemnly accentuated now, and each, as it drips from the pendulum, says, I am life, intolerable, implacable life. There is not a second in mortal life whose mission it is to bear good news, the good news that brings the inexplicable tear to the eye. Yes, time reigns. Time has regained his brutal mastery, and he goads me as though I were a steer with his double goad. Woe, thou fool! Sweat then, thou slave! Live on, thou damned! End of section 9. Section 10 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At 1 o'clock in the morning. Alone at last. Nothing is to be heard but the rattle of a few tardy and tired-out cabs. There will be silence now, if not repose, for several hours at least. At last the tyranny of the human face has disappeared. I shall not suffer except alone. At last it is permitted me to refresh myself in a bath of shadows. But first a double turn of the key in the lock. It seems to me that this turn of the key will deepen my solitude and strengthen the barriers which actually separate me from the world. A horrible life and a horrible city. Let us run over the events of the day. I have seen several literary men. One of them wished to know if he could get to Russia by land. He seemed to have an idea that Russia was an island. I have disputed generously enough with the editor of a review, who to each objection replied, We take the part of respectable people, which implies that every other paper but his own is edited by a knave. I have saluted some 20 people, 15 of them unknown to me, and shaken hands with a like number without having taken the precaution of first buying gloves. I have been driven to kill time during a shower with a mountebank who wanted me to design for her a costume as Venusta. I have made my bow to a theater manager who said, "You will do well, perhaps, to interview Z. He is the heaviest, foolishest, and most celebrated of all my authors. With him, perhaps, you will be able to come to something. See him, and then we'll see." I have boasted, why, of several villainous deeds I never committed, and indignantly denied certain shameful things I accomplished with joy, certain misdeeds of fanfaronade, crimes of human respect. I have refused an easy favor to a friend and given a written recommendation to a perfect fool. Heavens, it's well ended. Discontented with myself and with everything and everybody else, I should be glad enough to redeem myself and regain my self-respect in the silence and solitude. Souls of those whom I have loved, whom I have sung, fortify me, sustain me, drive away the lies and the corrupting vapors of this world. And thou, Lord my God, accord me so much grace as shall produce some beautiful verse to prove to myself that I am not the last of men, that I am not inferior to those I despise. End of section 10. Section 11 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Confiteor of the Artist. How penetrating is the end of an autumn day! Ah, yes, penetrating enough to be painful even. For there are certain delicious sensations whose vagueness does not prevent them from being intense, and none more keen than the perception of the infinite. He has a great delight who drowns his gaze in the immensity of sky and sea. Solitude, silence, the incomparable chastity of the azure, a little sail trembling upon the horizon, by its very littleness and isolation imitating my irremediable existence, the melodious monotone of the surge. All these things thinking through me and I through them, for in the grandeur of the reverie the ego is swiftly lost. They think, I say, but musically and picturesquely, without quibbles, without syllogisms, without deductions. These thoughts, as they arise in me or spring forth from external objects, soon become always too intense. The energy working within pleasure creates an uneasiness, a positive suffering. My nerves are too tense to give another than clamoring and dolorous vibrations. And now the profundity of the sky dismays me. Its limpidity exasperates me. The insensibility of the sea, the immutability of the spectacle, revolt me. Ah, must one eternally suffer, for ever be a fugitive from beauty? Nature, pitiless, enchantress, ever victorious rival, leave me. Tempt my desires and my pride no more. The contemplation of beauty is a duel where the artist screams with terror before being vanquished. End of section 11. Section 12 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Thyrsus. To Franz Liszt. What is a thyrsus? According to the moral and poetical sense, it is a sacerdotal emblem in the hand of the priests or priestesses celebrating the divinity of whom they are the interpreters and servants. But physically it is no more than a baton, a pure staff, a hop pole, a vine prop, dry, straight, and hard. Around this baton, in capricious meanderings, stems and flowers twine and wanton. These sinuous and fugitive, those hanging like bells or inverted cups, and an astonishing complexity disengages itself from this complexity of tender or brilliant lines and colors. Would not one suppose that the curved line and the spiral pay their court to the straight line and twine about it in a mute adoration? Would not one say that all these delicate corollae, all these calices, explosions of odors and colors, execute a mystical dance around the hieratic staff? And what imprudent mortal will dare to decide whether the flowers and the vine branches have been made for the baton, or whether the baton is not but a pretext to set forth the beauty of the vine branches and the flowers? The Thyrsus is the symbol of your astonishing duality, O powerful and venerated master, dear bacchanal of a mysterious and impassioned beauty. Never a nymph excited by the mysterious Dionysus shook her Thyrsus over the heads of her companions with as much energy as your genius trembles in the hearts of your brothers. The baton is your will, erect, firm, unshakable. The flowers are the wanderings of your fancy around it. The feminine element encircling the masculine with her elusive dance. Straight line and arabesque, intention and expression, the rigidity of the will and the suppleness of the word, a variety of means united for a single purpose, the all-powerful and indivisible amalgam that is genius. What analyst will have the detestable courage to divide or to separate you? Dear Liszt, across the fogs, beyond the flowers, in towns where the pianos chant your glory, where the printing house translates your wisdom, in whatever place you be, in the splendor of the eternal city, or among the fogs of the dreamy towns that Cambrinus consoles, improvising rituals of delight or ineffable pain, or giving to paper your abstruse meditations, singer of eternal pleasure and pain, philosopher, poet, and artist, I offer you the salutation of immortality. End of section 12. Section 13 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Marksman. As the carriage traversed the wood, he bade the driver draw up in the neighborhood of a shooting gallery, saying that he would like to have a few shots to kill time. Is not the slaying of the monster Time the most ordinary and legitimate occupation of man? So he gallantly offered his hand to his dear, adorable, and execrable wife, the mysterious woman to whom he owed so many pleasures, so many pains, and perhaps also a great part of his genius. Several bullets went wide of the proposed mark. One of them flew far into the heavens, and as the charming creature laughed deliriously, mocking the clumsiness of her husband, he turned to her brusquely and said, "Observe that doll yonder, to the right, with its nose in the air, and with so haughty an appearance. Very well, dear angel, I will imagine to myself that it is you." He closed both eyes and pulled the trigger. The doll was neatly decapitated. Then, bending towards his dear, adorable, and execrable wife, his inevitable and pitiless muse, he kissed her respectfully upon the hand and added, "Ah, dear angel, how I thank you for my skill." End of section 13. Section 14 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Shooting Range and the Cemetery. "Cemetery View Inn. A queer sign," said our traveler to himself, "but it raises a thirst. Certainly the keeper of this inn appreciates Horace and the poet pupils of Epicurus. Perhaps he even apprehends the profound philosophy of those old Egyptians who had no feast without its skeleton, or some emblem of life's brevity." He entered, drank a glass of beer in presence of the tombs, and slowly smoked a cigar. Then, his fantasy driving him, he went down into the cemetery, where the grass was so tall and inviting, so brilliant in the sunshine. The light and heat indeed were so furiously intense that one had said the drunken sun wallowed upon a carpet of flowers that had fattened upon the corruption beneath. The air was heavy with vivid rumors of life, the life of things infinitely small, and broken at intervals by the crackling of shots from a neighboring shooting range that exploded with a sound as of champagne corks to the burden of a hollow symphony. And then, beneath a sun which scorched the brain, and in that atmosphere charged with the ardent perfume of death, he heard a voice whispering out of the tomb where he sat, and this voice said, "Accursed be your rifles and targets, you turbulent living ones, who care so little for the dead in their divine repose. Accursed be your ambitions and calculations, importunate mortals who study the arts of slaughter near the sanctuary of death himself. Did you but know how easy the prize to win, how facile the end to reach, and how all save death is naught, not so greatly would you fatigue yourselves, O ye laborious alive, nor would you so often vex the slumber of them that long ago reached the end, the only true end of life detestable." End of section 14. Section 15 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The desire to paint. Unhappy, perhaps, is the man, but happy the artist, who is torn with this desire. I burn to paint a certain woman who has appeared to me so rarely, and so swiftly fled away, like some beautiful, regrettable thing the traveler must leave behind him in the night. It is already long since I saw her. She is beautiful, and more beautiful, she is overpowering. The color black preponderates in her. All that she inspires is nocturnal and profound. Her eyes are two caverns where mystery vaguely stirs and gleams. Her glance illuminates like a ray of light. It is an explosion in the darkness. I would compare her to a black sun if one could conceive of a dark star overthrowing light and happiness. But it is the moon that she makes one dream of most readily, the moon who has without doubt touched her with her own influence, not the white moon of the idyls, who resembles a cold bride, but the sinister and intoxicating moon suspended in the depths of a stormy night among the driven clouds. Not the discreet, peaceful moon who visits the dreams of pure men, but the moon torn from the sky, conquered and revolted, that the witches of Thessaly hardly constrain to dance upon the terrified grass. Her small brow is the habitation of a tenacious will and the love of prey. And below this inquiet face, whose mobile nostrils breathe in the unknown and the impossible, glitters, with an unspeakable grace, the smile of a large mouth. White, red, and delicious. A mouth that makes one dream of the miracle of some superb flower unclosing in a volcanic land. There are women who inspire one with the desire to woo them and win them, but she makes one wish to die slowly beneath her steady gaze. End of section 15. Section 16 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Glass Vendor. These are some natures purely contemplative and antipathetic to action, who nevertheless, under a mysterious and inexplicable impulse, sometimes act with a rapidity of which they would have believed themselves incapable. Such a one is he who, fearing to find some new vexation awaiting him at his lodgings, prowls about in a cowardly fashion before the door without daring to enter. Such a one is he who keeps a letter 15 days without opening it, or only makes up his mind at the end of 6 months to undertake a journey that has been a necessity for a year past. Such beings sometimes feel themselves precipitately thrust towards action, like an arrow from a bow. The novelist and the physician, who profess to know all things, yet cannot explain whence comes this sudden and delirious energy to indolent and voluptuous souls, nor how, incapable of accomplishing the simplest and most necessary things, they are at some certain moment of time possessed by a superabundant hardihood, which enables them to execute the most absurd and even the most dangerous acts. One of my friends, the most harmless dreamer that ever lived, at one time set fire to a forest, in order to ascertain, as he said, whether the flames take hold with the easiness that is commonly affirmed. His experiment failed 10 times running. On the 11th, it succeeded only too well. Another lit a cigar by the side of a powder barrel in order to see, to know, to tempt destiny for a jest, to have the pleasure of suspense, for no reason at all, out of caprice, out of idleness. This is a kind of energy that springs from weariness and reverie, and those in whom it manifests so stubbornly are in general, as I have said, the most indolent and dreamy beings. Another so timid that he must cast down his eyes before the gaze of any man, and summon all his poor will before he dare enter a cafe or pass the pay-box of a theatre, where the ticket-seller seems, in his eyes, invested with all the majesty of Minos, Eacus, and Rhadamanthus, will at times throw himself upon the neck of some old man whom he sees in the street, and embrace him with enthusiasm in sight of an astonished crowd. Why? Because this countenance is irresistibly attractive to him? Perhaps, but it is more legitimate to suppose that he himself does not know why. I have been more than once a victim to these crises and outbreaks, which give us cause to believe that evil-meaning demons slip into us, to make us the ignorant accomplices of their most absurd desires. One morning I arose in a sullen mood, very sad and tired of idleness, and thrust, as it seemed to me, the doing of some great thing, some brilliant act, and then, alas, I opened the window. I beg you to observe that in some people the spirit of mystification is not the result of labor or combination, but rather of a fortuitous inspiration which would partake, were it not for the strength of the feeling, of the mood called hysterical by the physician, and satanic by those who think a little more profoundly than the physician, the mood which thrusts us unresisting to a multitude of dangerous and inconvenient acts. The first person I noticed in the street was a glass vendor whose shrill and discordant cry mounted up to me through the heavy, dull atmosphere of Paris. It would have been else impossible to account for the sudden and despotic hatred of this poor man that came upon me. "Hello there," I cried, and bade him ascend. Meanwhile I reflected, not without gaiety, that as my room was on the 6th landing, and the stairway very narrow, the man would have some difficulty in ascending, and in many a place would break off the corners of his fragile merchandise. At length he appeared. I examined all his glasses with curiosity, and then said to him, "What, have you no colored glasses? Glasses of rose and crimson and blue? Magical glasses? Glasses of paradise? You are insolent. You dare to walk in mean streets when you have no glasses that would make one see beauty in life?" And I hurried him briskly to the staircase, which he staggered down grumbling. I went on to the balcony and caught up a little flower-pot, and when the man appeared in the doorway beneath, I let fall my engine of war perpendicularly upon the edge of his pack, so that it was upset by the shock, and all his poor walking fortune broke into bits. It made a noise like a palace of crystal shattered by lightning. Mad with my folly, I cried furiously after him, "The life beautiful! The life beautiful!" Such nervous pleasantries are not without peril. Often enough one pays dearly for them. But what matters an eternity of damnation to him who has found in 1 second an eternity of enjoyment? End of section 16. Section 17 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Widows. Vauvenargues says that in public gardens there are alleys haunted principally by thwarted ambition, by unfortunate inventors, by aborted glories and broken hearts, and by all those tumultuous and contracted souls in whom the last sighs of the storm mutter yet again, and who thus betake themselves far from the insolent and joyous eyes of the well-to-do. These shadowy retreats are the rendezvous of life's cripples. To such places above all others do the poet and philosopher direct their avid conjectures. They find there an unfailing pasturage, for if there is one place they disdain to visit, it is, as I have already hinted, the place of the joy of the rich. A turmoil in the void has no attractions for them. On the contrary, they feel themselves irresistibly drawn towards all that is feeble, ruined, sorrowing, and bereft. An experienced eye is never deceived. In these rigid and dejected lineaments, in these eyes, wan and hollow, or bright with the last fading gleams of the combat against fate, in these numerous profound wrinkles, and in the slow and troubled gait, the eye of experience deciphers unnumbered legends of mistaken devotion, of unrewarded effort, of hunger and cold humbly and silently supported. Have you not at times seen widows sitting on the deserted benches? Poor widows, I mean. Whether in mourning or not, they are easily recognized. Moreover, there is always something wanting in the mourning of the poor, a lack of harmony which but renders it the more heart-breaking. It is forced to be niggardly in its show of grief. They are the rich who exhibit a full complement of sorrow. Who is the saddest and most saddening of widows? She who leads by the hand a child who cannot share her reveries, or she who is quite alone? I do not know. It happened that I once followed for several long hours an aged and afflicted woman of this kind. Rigid and erect, wrapped in a little worn shawl, she carried in all her being the pride of stoicism. She was evidently condemned by her absolute loneliness to the habits of an ancient celibacy, and the masculine characters of her habits added to their austerity a piquant mysteriousness. In what miserable café she dines I know not, nor in what manner. I followed her to a reading-room, and for a long time watched her reading the papers, her active eyes that once burned with tears, seeking for news of a powerful and personal interest. At length, in the afternoon, under a charming autumnal sky, one of those skies that let fall hosts of memories and regrets, she seated herself remotely in a garden to listen, far from the crowd, to one of the regimental bands whose music gratifies the people of Paris. This was without doubt the small debauch of the innocent old woman, or the purified old woman, the well-earned consolation for another of the burdensome days without a friend, without conversation, without joy, without a confidant, that God had allowed to fall upon her perhaps for many years past, 365 times a year. Yet, one more. I can never prevent myself from throwing a glance, if not sympathetic, at least full of curiosity, over the crowd of outcasts who press around the enclosure of a public concert. From the orchestra, across the night, float songs of fête, of triumph, or of pleasure. The dresses of the women sweep and shimmer, glances pass. The well-to-do, tired with doing nothing, saunter about and make indolent pretense of listening to the music. Here are only the rich, the happy. Here is nothing that does not inspire or exhale the pleasure of being alive, except the aspect of the mob that presses against the outer barrier yonder, catching gratis, at the will of the wind, a tatter of music, and watching the glittering furnace within. There is a reflection of the joy of the rich deep in the eyes of the poor that is always interesting. But today, beyond this people dressed in blouses and calico, I saw one whose nobility was in striking contrast with all the surrounding triviality. She was a tall, majestic woman, and so imperious in all her air that I cannot remember having seen the like in the collections of the aristocratic beauties of the past. A perfume of exalted virtue emanated from all her being. Her face, sad and worn, was in perfect keeping with the deep mourning in which she was dressed. She also, like the plebeians she mingled with and did not see, looked upon the luminous world with a profound eye, and listened with a toss of her head. It was a strange vision. Most certainly, I said to myself, this poverty, if poverty it be, ought not to admit of any sordid economy. So noble a face answers for that. Why then does she remain in surroundings with which she is so strikingly in contrast? But in curiously passing near her, I was able to divine the reason. The tall widow held by the hand a child dressed like herself in black. Modest as was the price of entry, this price, perhaps, sufficed to pay for some of the needs of the little being, or even more, for a superfluity, a toy. She will return on foot, dreaming and meditating, and alone, always alone, for the child is turbulent and selfish, without gentleness or patience, and cannot become, any more than another animal, a dog or a cat, the confidant of solitary griefs. End of section 17. Section 18 of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Temptations, or Eros, Plutus, and Glory. Last night, 2 superb Satans and a she-devil not less extraordinary ascended the mysterious stairway by which hell gains access to the frailty of sleeping man, and communes with him in secret. These 3 postured gloriously before me, as though they had been upon a stage, and a sulphurous splendor emanated from these beings who so disengaged themselves from the opaque heart of the night. They bore with them so proud a presence, and so full of mastery, that at first I took them for 3 of the true gods. The first Satan, by his face, was a creature of doubtful sex. The softness of an ancient Bacchus shone in the lines of his body. His beautiful languorous eyes, of a tenebrous and indefinite color, were like violets still laden with the heavy tears of the storm. His slightly parted lips were like heated censers, from whence exhaled the sweet savor of many perfumes, and each time he breathed, exotic insects drew, as they fluttered, strength from the ardors of his breath. Twined about his tunic of purple stuff in the manner of a cincture was an iridescent serpent with lifted head and eyes like embers turned sleepily towards him. Phials full of sinister fluids, alternating with shining knives and instruments of surgery, hung from this living girdle. He held in his right hand a flagon containing a luminous red fluid, and inscribed with a legend in these singular words, "Drink of this my blood, a perfect restorative." And in his left hand held a violin that without doubt served to sing his pleasures and pains, and to spread abroad the contagion of his folly upon the nights of the Sabbath. From rings upon his delicate ankles trailed a broken chain of gold, and when the burden of this caused him to bend his eyes towards the earth, he would contemplate with vanity the nails of his feet, as brilliant and polished as well-wrought jewels. He looked at me with eyes inconsolably heartbroken, and giving forth an insidious intoxication, and cried in a chanting voice, if thou wilt, I will make thee an overlord of souls. Thou shalt be master of living matter more perfectly than the sculptor is master of his clay. Thou shalt taste the pleasure, reborn without end, of obliterating thyself in the self of another, and of luring other souls to lose themselves in thine. But I replied to him, I thank thee. I only gain from this venture, then, beings of no more worth than my poor self. Though remembrance brings me shame indeed, I would forget nothing. And even before I recognized thee, thou ancient monster, thy mysterious cutlery, thy equivocal phials, and the chain that imprisons thy feet, were symbols showing clearly enough the inconvenience of thy friendship. Keep thy gifts. The second Satan had neither the air at once tragical and smiling, the lovely insinuating ways, nor the delicate and scented beauty of the first. A gigantic man with a coarse, eyeless face, his heavy paunch overhung his hips and was gilded and pictured like a tattooing, with a crowd of little moving figures which represented the unnumbered forms of universal misery. There were little sinew-shrunken men who hung themselves willingly from nails. There were meager gnomes, deformed and undersized, whose beseeching eyes begged an alms even more eloquently than their trembling hands. There were old mothers who nursed clinging abortions at their pendant breasts, and many others even more surprising. This heavy Satan beat with his fist upon his immense belly, from whence came a loud and resounding metallic clangor, which died away in a sighing made by many human voices. And he smiled unrestrainedly, showing his broken teeth, the imbecile smile of a man who has dined too freely. Then the creature said to me, "I can give thee that which gets all, which is worth all, which takes the place of all." And he tapped his monstrous paunch, whence came a sonorous echo as the commentary to his obscene speech. I turned away with disgust and replied, "I need no man's misery to bring me happiness, nor will I have the sad wealth of all the misfortunes pictured upon thy skin, as upon a tapestry. As for the she-devil, I should lie if I denied that at first I found in her a certain strange charm, which to define I can but compare to the charm of certain beautiful women past their first youth, who yet seem to age no more, whose beauty keeps something of the penetrating magic of ruins. She had an air at once imperious and sordid, and her eyes, though heavy, held a certain power of fascination. I was struck most by her voice, wherein I found the remembrance of the most delicious contralti, as well as a little of the hoarseness of a throat continually laved with brandy. "Wouldst thou know my power?" said the charming and paradoxical voice of the false goddess. "Then listen." And she put to her mouth a gigantic trumpet, enribboned, like a merliton, with the titles of all the newspapers in the world. And through this trumpet she cried my name so that it rolled through space with the sound of 100,000 thunders, and came re-echoing back to me from the farthest planet. "Devil!" cried I, half-tempted. "That at least is worth something." But it vaguely struck me upon examining the seductive virago more attentively that I had seen her clinking glasses with certain drolls of my acquaintance, and her blare of brass carried to my ears I know not what memory of a fanfare prostituted. So I replied with all disdain, "Get thee hence! I know better than wed the light o' love of them that I will not name." Truly, I had the right to be proud of a so courageous renunciation. But unfortunately I awoke, and all my courage left me. "In truth," I said, "I must have been very deeply asleep indeed to have had such scruples. Ah, if they would but return while I am awake, I would not be so delicate." So I invoked the three in a loud voice, offering to dishonor myself as often as necessary to obtain their favors. But I had without doubt too deeply offended them, for they have never returned. End of section 18, and end of Little Poems in Prose by Charles Baudelaire. Read by Ben Tucker.